everyone. Good afternoon. I am not used to a microphone, so you just raise a hand if it starts to get hard to hear. So I really want to thank Katie and Katrina for this chance to spend some time with you today. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the things that I learned while writing this book. While writing the book, I had the very unique experience of just listening. I listened to dozens of people as they talked to me about how they live with HD and how they cope with HD. And what I found is that when all of these stories came together, I discovered that we have an awful lot that we can learn from each other. So the stories in the book are based on interviews that I did with more than 30 people from 10 different countries. And at the very beginning of every interview, we would introduce ourselves. And I have found that when we tell somebody our connection to HD, many of us follow kind of a simple little script. We'll tell people where we're from, our name, we'll tell them when or how we first learned about HD. We might tell them about our family members who have HD, and then we might tell them our gene status. So this happened in almost every interview, and then I find that it happens at events like this. So my introduction goes something like this. So my name is Christy. I live in Idaho. I first learned about Huntington's disease in 2014. When my older brother was the very first person in my family to be diagnosed. At that point, my siblings and I, we already had kids, so there were 10 of us who could potentially have the disease. My dad and my grandpa, they both had telltale symptoms, but neither one of them ever got the right diagnosis. And I tested negative in 2019. So anybody who belongs to an HD family knows that these introductions hint at a much bigger story. There's so much more to each of our stories. When we hear somebody's story, we quickly understand a lot about them. And we also understand how their story compares to our own. So somebody who has known about HD most of their life has a very different experience than somebody like me who learns about it later in life, when a family member or maybe they themselves are diagnosed. Somebody who comes from a family in which maybe one person in each generation has the disease has a very different experience than somebody from a family where many people in each generation have the disease. Somebody who is at risk is at a very different point in their journey than somebody who knows their gene status. But even though there are these kind of small differences across these stories, we all have so much in common. So what's often missing in our introductions are the many ways that HD impacts our lives. We typically don't talk about how HD impacts our relationships or our identities. We don't always talk about how HD impacts our emotional well-being or how we make decisions. We rarely talk about how HD impacts just about every aspect of our lives. And I know that I find it impossible to tell my full story. And then I also find that when it comes time to tell somebody about HD, if they don't know very much about it, I find it really difficult to really explain it all. In both cases, it feels like there's just so much more I wish I could share. So it turns out that many of the details that we leave out of our stories, sometimes those are the kinds of things that could really help other people understand HD and how it impacts our community. So an important part of my family's story is that we experienced it for generations without knowing anything about it because my dad and my grandpa were both misdiagnosed. So I lived most of my life knowing nothing about HD, but I distinctly remember the very first time I encountered it. When I was 7 years old, I met my grandpa for the very first time. He was no longer able to walk. He was no longer able to speak clearly. He was living in a psychiatric hospital, and his doctors thought he had Parkinson's disease. He died a couple of years later, and without ever knowing he had HD. And then when I was a teenager, my dad started changing quite a bit. He started having trouble relating to other people. He got let go from his job. And he developed a variety of psychiatric symptoms that resulted in 2 extended stays in a behavioral health center. My dad's psychiatrist was never able to pinpoint a diagnosis. His symptoms just did not fit anything. But what I find really strange is that my dad had these unusual movements that I remember. decades later. I don't know why my dad's psychiatrist did not see my dad's career. I don't know why my dad's psychiatrist did not realize my dad needed to see a neurologist. When I was 25, my dad died of cancer, and once again, my family knew nothing about HD. So my family story changed significantly when my brother was diagnosed in 2014. He had been having a variety of symptoms for several years, and we really felt like if we found answers for him, if we found a diagnosis for him, we could help him get better. But instead, my brother's HD diagnosis meant that we were now worried about many family members instead of just one. So after I tested negative, I kept thinking back to when I first learned about HD and just how overwhelming that was. I really did not know how to help the people around me understand what my family was facing. I was still learning about the disease myself. I was still trying to figure out what it meant for me and my family. And I also found that other people's expectations about what I must be going through really didn't fit what I was feeling. And I think this really comes down to a lack of understanding about HD. So very few people understand what it means to have a family disease that impacts generation after generation. Very few people understand the full extent of HD and its many symptoms. And very few people understand just how difficult it is to have to consider whether or not to do genetic testing. And there's really not an easy way to help somebody understand all of the things that make this a really complicated disease. So I decided I really wanted to try to do something, and I wanted to do something that could really help tell that bigger story. I really wanted to create something that we could give to the people around us. I wanted something we could give to friends and other family members and professionals who work with us. I wanted to give people an inside peek into HD and the many ways that it impacts this community. And it was really important to me that the book be centered around a personal story. So when I was new to HD, I needed those personal stories. I needed to see how other people lived with HD. I needed to see how other people coped with HD, so I could figure out how I was going to do that for myself. And I also wanted to create something that could serve as a starting point for conversations. HD is difficult to explain to other people, and it can be really difficult to talk about. And sometimes we need help getting those conversations started. And I do feel that based on some of the feedback I have received so far about the book, it is having that impact. So it's just one example. When one of the storytellers from the book shared her story with her husband, she said they had a conversation they had never had before. After reading her story, he felt like he had a new and better understanding of HD and what it meant for her to be at risk and what it meant for her to be belong to an HD family. I do want to share a little bit about the process of writing Livable Lives. Because I wanted the book to be based on stories, I needed to find people to talk to. And for some reason, I thought this was going to be difficult. But within hours of sending out my invitations, emails started pouring in. And I was just so surprised at the number of people who responded. And I said yes to every single one of them. So after I talked to more than 30 people, I had more than 60 hours of recorded conversations. And so I went from wondering if I was going to have enough content to write a full book to wondering how in the world I was going to include dozens of stories. As I wrote the stories in the book, it was really important to me that I tried to stay true to what people wanted to share with the rest of the world. Some of the people I talked to were already very comfortable sharing their stories publicly. They had done so many times before. This was not new for them. But there were people I spoke with who had never ever done this. And so I tried to be really sensitive to just how scary that must be. And for everybody, I gave people multiple chances to see their stories, request edits, make sure that what we were sharing in the book was truly what they wanted to share. It was also really important to me that the book include a variety of perspectives because there are many ways to experience this disease. So I made sure to talk to people who are at risk, gene positive, gene negative, I also spoke with family members, care providers, and people. So I would love for all of you to take a moment and just think about what it would be like to talk about your HD story for 2 hours or longer. That's what these conversations were like. They were very personal, they were very emotional. And what I found is that when people had that chance, they had that safe space to just tell their story the way they wanted to hear it. There was much more discussion about the impacts of age than what we typically share. Now I want to give a quick shout out to Jimmy Pollard. Jimmy so kindly wrote the foreword for the book. And when I reached out to him, I did ask him if he would consider writing about what he thinks makes this a special community. And he nailed it. He wrote about the community as a family that is welcoming and non-judgmental and resilient and so much more. And I really could not have asked for a better introduction to the book, so I just want to say thank you very much. So I did wait to write most of the book until after I had done most of the interviews. I wanted the book to take shape around the kinds of things people were sharing with me rather than what I thought should be in the book. And as I listened to people tell their stories, there were certain things that came up over and over. And so these are the kinds of things that became the backbone of the book. People, they talked about what it meant to have a family disease. They talked about the challenges of providing care. They talked about genetic testing and how HD impacts their relationships. And after talking to so many people, I really do feel like I have a much deeper understanding of HD, how it impacts people around the world, and the kinds of things people do to cope. And these are the kinds of things that are included in the book. So some of what I learned came directly from a list of questions that I developed before I started the interviews. But I think it's important for you to know that even though I had a list of questions, I talked very, very little in these conversations. But one question I did try to ask in most conversations is tied to a lot of really complex feelings for all of us. But it helps me understand an awful lot about each person's story. I asked people if they remembered what their parent or other loved one was like before they started having HD symptoms. And to me, this was a really, really important question because the way we experience our loved one's disease has a major impact on how we cope with HD in our own lives. So I know that when I was at risk, the way that I thought about my future was heavily influenced by how I experienced my dad's disease. And there are a few things that I hoped I would learn from this question. I wanted to know how long HD had been a major part of each person's life. And I did want to know if people felt like they had had that chance to get to know their loved one. So if the storyteller was very young when their loved one started having symptoms, then they would tell me, right, I did not really get that chance that I really wish I had had. But if the storyteller was a little older, then they would tell me what it was like to watch their loved one change over time. And either way, this is a really, really difficult part of our HD experience. I also hoped that this question would help me understand how HD symptoms impacted these close relationships. We all know that maintaining relationships as a loved one's symptoms change can be very challenging. So over time, physical changes impact their ability to speak clearly. Cognitive changes impact their ability to participate fully in conversations. And behavioral changes impact how our loved ones interpret the world and how they respond. And altogether, these changes can make it more and more difficult to relate to our loved ones in the ways that we used to. And again, this is a really, really difficult part of the HD experience. But despite these challenges, the people I spoke with also talked about the things that they do to maintain these really important connections, these important relationships. Many people make a point of spending a lot of time together and making sure that they create positive memories. A lot of people find new ways to communicate with each other. And a lot of people continue to tell their loved ones stories so that the people around their loved one can continue to know them. And what was very, very clear in these conversations is that for many of us, maintaining these close connections is so important. It helps us make sure that our loved ones know that they are still loved. And it helps us make sure that our loved ones know that they still have a story to tell, even if they need help telling it. So another question I tried to ask in most interviews was whether people have hope, and if so, where do they find it? So hope can be a very complicated topic for many of us for many reasons. There really are times when this disease is so difficult, it can feel really difficult to have hope. Many of us are very wary of having false hope. And many of us have been told that we just need to have hope. But I think we all know that it takes an awful lot more than hope to get through the harder times. But I do really want to share what I heard when I asked this question, because I think it offers a little food for thought. So I asked about hope because I thought it would give me some insight into how people cope with grief. It would help me understand the kinds of things that do help people get through those harder times. A lot of people did say they find hope in research, but other people said that they are not sure that research will progress quickly enough to benefit their family members or themselves. And research is mostly out of our hands. It really is up to other people to make research successful. And we have very little control over if or when a treatment will be available. But people also talk about hope as it relates to things that they are a part of. Things like raising awareness, participating in clinical trials, advocating for the best care for their loved ones, and connecting with others in the HIPE community. And when people talked about finding hope in the things that they were involved in, the things that they were doing to make a difference, it seemed really empowering and meaningful to them. There are several examples of this in the book, and I know that I see many, many examples of this all throughout the HIPE community. There are so many people in this community who work tirelessly to support and advocate for each other. And so my takeaway is that when this community comes together and when we work together and support each other, we can create hope through those kinds of actions. So every now and then I would hear something in a conversation that continues to stick with me. There were stark examples of just how difficult this disease can be. Several storytellers talked about the challenges of providing care at a very young age. I spoke with two families who talked about the heartbreaking challenges of having a child with juvenile HD. Several young adults were trying to figure out what they wanted their futures to look like. And everybody spoke about the losses their parents had faced. People also talked about the things that they had gained from their experiences. So more compassion for others, sometimes closer ties to family members, close friendships, and sometimes an ability to live with uncertainty. And then there was my conversation with Brianna. So Brianna was in college at the time, and she told me that before she got tested for HD, she came up with two plans for her future. She had one plan for what she wanted her life to look like if she tested positive, and another plan for what it would look like if she tested negative. So when she did test positive, she knew what she wanted her path forward to look like. And then she talked about what she wants her life to look like between now and when her symptoms begin. She said, I call it my livable life, the time when I can do the things that I want to do. So this is a really important period of time for people who are at risk or gene positive. This is the time before HD, when people feel like they can live a full life. And many people put a lot of pressure on themselves to make the most of this time. But even though this is the period before HD, we all know that HD is still there. People continue to have family members impacted by the disease. They still have to cope with their own gene status. And they still have to figure out how to incorporate HD into their lives and into important decisions, like having a career or having a family. And even though Brianna used her livable life term to refer to this period of time before she had symptoms, I kept coming back to it as I listened to other conversations, and I really felt like she had created a term that captures a lot more of the HD story. So one thing I've heard in these conversations is that there is a lot of room in a life with ADHD to make choices. And a lot of people in this community do make intentional choices about what they want their lives to look like. In almost every conversation, people talk about how ADHD impacts the decisions they make, their outlook on life, and the things that they do to cope. One person said that she wakes up every morning and intentionally decides to have a positive attitude every single day, even though that is really, really challenging. One young woman decided she wanted to start a family at a young age so that she'll have more time to spend with her daughter before she herself becomes symptomatic. A lot of people prioritize their own mental and physical health, and some people get involved in advocacy. I heard example after example of the things that people do to live the life that they want to live and to cope as well as they can. There really are so many people in this community who do their very, very best every single day to live a good life and make a difference in the lives of others. So Brianna's livable life term can also refer to the kinds of things we do to make sure that our loved ones with HD have the best quality of life. We can do this by advocating for better care for them. We can do this by educating the people around them about HD. And many of us do this by doing things that bring joy to our loved ones. This might include things like making sure we spend time with them, focusing on the things that they can do, and helping them enjoy their favorite thing. For my brother, this means spending time with family, watching the sounds play, eating pizza, and having milkshakes. So when I talked to Brianna the first time, she was still coping with learning that she was gene positive. And at that point, her livable life term really referred to the things that she wants to do before she becomes symptomatic. But I talked to Brianna again about 2 years later, and she told me by that point, she really felt like the way she thinks about her livable life is changed. Now she says her livable life is more about focusing on the things that are really important to her and making sure she makes a point of looking for the good things in her life, even when things are really difficult. So as I listened to story after story, it was always very clear that a life with HD is difficult. But it was also very clear that many of us do what we can to live a good life with HD. And I do know that creating a livable life cannot make up for what HD takes away. But I also think that when we are faced with the disease that is debilitating for our whole family, sometimes the only thing we can do is try to find meaning and purpose in how we respond. So I want to thank you very much for having me.